If you're going to get on, then get on, you naff. If you're not getting on, then get off. That was the Clippies, they rare nippy sweeties with their ticket machines and their laugh. Then the buses went strange with the machines with no change, and the wee nippy sweeties get paid off. Now the one-man drivers have nae any patter, and you can't have a blether or a laugh. And when there's some nutter causing some bother, there's nae nippy sweetie to chuck a laugh.
The trams in Glasgow last ran in 1962, 50 years ago, and yet the memories of the old cars as they were known linger on. The city's transport system included trams, buses, an underground system that was always called the subway, and the railways. And while the buses, subway and railways continue to this day in more modern versions, people still miss the trams. Of course, the majority of Glaswegians who use public transport today don't even remember the trams. For them it has always been the buses, the subway and the railways, and they can't miss what they can't remember. For many of the older generation, of course, it is not the trams themselves that are missed. Although there are plenty of enthusiasts still around who can name you every type, number and destination, it is the era in which they ran that is best remembered. That era between the 1930s and 1960s was when the older generation were growing up, and trams were a fixture in their childhood. They ran everywhere, to every district in the city, and the tram lines and overhead wires were a feature of the city. And yet today there is almost no trace left of them. The tracks are all gone, the wires have disappeared, and the cars themselves can only be seen in museums. The trams, of course, had been running since the 19th century. But the last days of the trams also seem to represent the end of an era in the city, as the 1960s brought in massive changes for a lot of people. Many of the old slum districts were being cleared, and thousands of people were scattered out into the new housing schemes, which sat in what they regarded as the countryside. And while a few trams did run out into some greenfield areas, no trams ran into the big housing schemes. There were no tram lines in Pollock, Castlemilk, Easterhouse or Drumchapel. Here the buses dominated. And it was the same buses that finally forced the trams out of existence. What is fascinating to many people about the archive footage of the trams is not the trams themselves, although people remember fondly the numbers of the trams they used. It is seeing the old districts with their shops and tenements where the trams used to go. It is seeing places and people that are no longer with us, and seeing the changes in the city as old tenement areas were swept away, often replaced by gleaming tower blocks that were hailed at the time as the solution to modern housing, but most of which quickly deteriorated into new slums and are themselves gone. It is also fascinating to note those areas of Glasgow that have not changed at all in the 100+ years of the electric tram's existence. If you were a commuter stepping on a tram in an area like Giffnock, for example, on the south side of the city in the early 1900s, you would not notice any great changes if you were to return there today. The houses and shops along Fenwick Road in Giffnock have not really changed in all that time, although the old Tudor cinema has closed, replaced now by an American-style Whole Foods market. There are no picture halls in Giffnock now, and that is the same for most areas of the city. Of course, there were no slums and precious few tenements in Giffnock. The affluent and green suburban areas like Giffnock, Pollokshields, Newlands and the west end of the city remain remarkably untouched by what passes for progress today. Not for them the high-rise blocks that were inflicted upon a great many of their fellow Glaswegians. The first trams, of course, were horse-drawn, and if anybody remembers them, then they should be in the Guinness Book of Records as the oldest person in the world, because the first electric trams appeared in 1897 and ran continuously until 1962. The 25th anniversary of the introduction of the electric trams was celebrated in 1922 in Glasgow city centre, with a procession of old horse-drawn cars. Why the people then wanted to celebrate such an occasion only they know. But you have to remember that there was no TV then, so people had to make their own entertainment. Celebrations and processions of all kinds and for all kinds of reasons were a feature of this era, and whatever the reason, it brought the crowds out in their thousands, and the newsreel cameras too, which recorded the occasion for posterity. In the early part of the 20th century, the newsreel cameras would often fix themselves to a tram or other vehicle and go out into the city to record the streets and people there. In 1910 and again in 1922, the cameras took themselves out to Great Western Road in the rather more genteel and salubrious West End of the city to shoot footage of the people who regularly strolled along this popular road, which has not really changed that much since those days. Between 1910 and 1922, of course, was the First World War, and on close inspection of the two films, there does seem to be a thinning of the male population in the second film. As they had open-top trams in those days, the trams were ideal for perching a bulky camera on to film the city and its population. It is amusing to watch the wee boys chasing the camera from point to point, so they will be in the film, and the dress of the people. Bustle dresses, bowler hats and boaters are not often seen in the West End today. Sadly, there are no such films of the local population in places like Govan, Gorbals or Bridgeton in the early part of the century, although this brief glimpse of a holiday procession in Springburn in 1922 is rare archive footage of the area. The Springburn children in this film were being taken away for a charitable day out to Rooken Glen Park near Giffnock, to breathe some fresh air, away no doubt from the smoke and smog of their own area. Often the films would be shown in local cinemas, where the community would flock to see themselves on the big screen. Nowadays, with the modern camcorders, people can make their own holiday and domestic videos of themselves, which, surprisingly for the producers of such films, nobody seems eager to see. Some of the tram routes in the past, like the number 9, which ran from the east end of the city through to Dalmuir West and Clydebank, took you on a grand tour of Glasgow. From Dalmuir West across the canal, through Scotstoun and Partick, along Dumbarton Road and Argyle Street into the city centre, and all the way along London Road into Bridgeton and Auchenshoogle. This could be a day out for some people in the city. And although the last trams ran in 1962, many of the routes had been discontinued a long time before that, as the buses began to take over. And once the last trams ran, the lines were quickly dug up in the streets and many of the old cars were scrapped or burnt. A few survived, of course, and now sit in various transport museums, including Glasgow's. Despite numerous calls for the reintroduction of the trams in Glasgow, the pleas have fallen on deaf ears, and with the recent catalogue of disasters surrounding the reintroduction of the trams in Edinburgh, it seems even less likely that it will happen in Glasgow. The buses in Glasgow too, of course, changed over the years. From the original backenders, which most people can still remember, with their conductors and conductresses shouting, "Are you getting on, are you getting off?" to the more modern one-man operated buses, which came in around the 1960s. The old backenders were cold in the winter though, and like the trams, people used to risk life and limb on a daily basis jumping on and off these vehicles, often while they were still travelling at speed, desperate to grab those extra few seconds which would get them to their destination before everyone else. Like the car drivers who move off on the amber instead of waiting for the green, their impatience could be costly. Needless to say, there were quite a few accidents where people lost teeth, limbs, and sometimes even their lives trying to jump on and off moving buses. When the new buses came in with automatic doors that closed, it was much warmer on the buses, and it saved a lot of teeth, limbs, and lives. And sadly, the conductors and conductresses disappeared as the one-man buses took over. In the beginning, the driver would give you change if you didn't have the exact fare, but this didn't last too long, and nowadays the drivers do not hold any cash and the money goes straight into a machine. And if you don't have the exact fare, then tough. People missed the patter of the Clippies most though, and there were more than a few characters amongst them. It could be a hazardous job too, however, having to deal regularly with the drunks, fare dodgers of every age and sex, and fly men and women trying to steal from your cash bag or pockets. You needed to be wise to the ways of the travelling public, possess a thick skin, a brave heart, and a wicked tongue to be a Clippy on the Glasgow Corporation buses of the past. The wicked tongues often belonged to the female Clippies, of which there were many on the buses and trams. I can remember one fiery wee Clippy on the 54 bus, which travelled from Crookston to Codder, a long journey then. She would ask passengers their destination. Where are ye for, she'd say. Sometimes the answer would be Maryhill. No, on this bus, she'd say. A man on the wrang bus, well, the passenger would wail. Only if you're gone to Maryhill, she'd reply with a wicked smile. The drivers and Clippies on buses and trams developed a close working relationship, and contrary to what some people might think, they did try and make their vehicles run in time, despite all the obstacles they had, like traffic lights, other traffic that got in their way, and of course pedestrians, who often seem to have a death wish, judging by their casual attitude to crossing the road in front of trams and buses. Sometimes too, the driver would be required to assist the conductor if a passenger became too obstreperous or even violent. If a female Clippy was involved, it was not unknown for a driver to put on the emergency brake, get out of his cab, sprint round to the interior of the bus and unceremoniously eject a troublesome passenger. There was one driver I can clearly remember, who shall remain nameless, who would stand upon no ceremony when a passenger threatened his Clippy. He would jump from his cab, board the bus and punch the lights out of the offending passenger. Then he would throw him, or occasionally her, off the bus, regardless of where they were. He took no prisoners, and yet nobody ever complained. At night time, particularly when it was damp and foggy, a regular occurrence in the Glasgow of the past, the trams looked like big mobile lanterns as they hurtled along the often cobbled streets. Some unkind people referred to them as ghosts haunting the Glasgow streets at night. But the coming in of the Clean Air Act quickly banished the smog and fog that were a feature of Glasgow right into the 1960s and beyond. Nowadays it is rare to see a foggy night in Glasgow, but they still happen occasionally. The streets in the city centre of Glasgow have not changed much over the decades. The main thoroughfares of Argyle Street, Sauchiehall Street, Hope Street and Renfield Street remain as they have been for as long as I can remember. Only the shops change and the style of the buses and cars and the fashions and the people of the day. Jamaica Street is a perfect example of this. The bridge across the Clyde is still there, and many of the buildings too from the distant past. Big shops like Paisley's, which used to supply school uniforms amongst other things, have sadly gone, but often the buildings remain, with new shops or offices inside. George Square looks pretty much as it looked in the past. Only the fashions of the people then have changed, and the city chambers in the background has not changed at all. Only the councillors, or flymen as some people refer to them, inside the city chambers have changed. The only thing that has not seemingly changed is their unpopularity amongst the local population. You wonder who it is that votes them in then. Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow has hardly changed from the early 1900s. It is still a main shopping thoroughfare, and although the trams or buses no longer run its full length as they used to, it is only the shops and fashions that have changed. The trams and tram lines are gone, but the street remains. The old Empire Theatre, so loved by English comedians, and the many cinemas on Sauchiehall Street are all gone. But they had not even been built when this film was made. Central Station on Gordon Street in the early 1900s does not look all that different from what it is today either. It is still full of people coming and going, from local commuters on the south side of the city and those from Paisley, Johnston and Ayrshire to the intercity traveller. The main intercity lines still run from Central Station to all the big cities in England. Only the train designs have changed, and they're a little bit faster now with much less pollution. And people still congregate at Central Station to head down the water in the summer months, as they have done for over a century. Two of the areas in Glasgow that have changed enormously are Anderston and Townhead. The motorway interchanges have torn the heart out of both districts. Parliamentary Road in Townhead was once a main thoroughfare for traffic, with hundreds of shops and pubs. Today the road has completely vanished. A small path that runs through modern Townhead is the only evidence that a main road once ran through here. The trams and buses, of course, would take you all over the city. If you wanted a grand tour, you just planned your route and hopped on and off. Some routes were long journeys, like Auchenshoogle to Dalmuir West or Crookston on the south side to Codder in the north, and they took you through many different districts. The Crookston to Codder bus route, for example, took you the length of Paisley Road West and the sights to see along the way. Past the Aldwych Cinema in Cardonald, now long gone, and past Bellahouston Park in Craigton. Then you would pass the White City Stadium, which was famous first for its greyhound racing before the speedway bikes took over. Nowadays the White City is gone, and the police now have their headquarters on the site. As the bus sped along Paisley Road West, you could just catch a glimpse of Ibrox Stadium, and then you were into Cessnock, where you passed the subway station. In the past, of course, the bulk of the population lived in or close to the city centre, so the underground system ran in a circle around the city centre. Now that the bulk of the population has moved out to the green suburbs, you might have expected the underground system to expand to serve these new areas, but it never happened. So now you still have a subway station in areas where far less people live, and no system out in the housing estates where hundreds of thousands of people live. That's planning for you. Back on the 54 bus, after Cessnock subway station, you were into Kinning Park, heading for Kingston and Tredston, with the River Clyde just beyond. Paisley Road Toll in Kinning Park was a very busy junction then and still is. Paisley Road heading west splits into two here, with one road heading for Cardonald and Paisley and the other to head past Plantation and into Govan. Most of the old tenements in Plantation are gone now, and many of the tenements on Govan Road have been demolished too, but the BBC and STV studios are bringing new life into the area, and the Waverley steamer continues to ply its trade down on the Clyde, beside the TV studios and the Science Centre. At Paisley Road Toll stood the Imperial Cinema, which was once called the Scenic or Snick and is now the Grand Old Opry. The building is over 100 years old and was once a warehouse for River Clyde cargo, when there were ships on the Clyde, and stables for the horses which would have pulled carts to distribute that cargo. In fact, very little has changed at Paisley Road Toll in 100 years. The old toll bar is still there, and the Angel building, which used to house Burton's the tailors for many years, but is now an Italian restaurant. A.E. Pickard, who used to run a chain of cinemas and theatres in the distant past in Glasgow, was once based in the Angel building too, but like most of his cinemas and theatres, he is long gone. Although many of the characters, tenements and works close by Paisley Road Toll have vanished over the decades, the toll itself has survived. And although the trams are gone, the buses and cars still hurtle past on a daily basis. From Paisley Road Toll you passed into Kingston and Tradeston, which housed a multitude of warehouse and engineering works serving the ships on the River Clyde. There is less industry here now, and there is little traffic on the River Clyde today. Beyond Tradeston you then crossed the Clyde over one of the many bridges there. The number 54 bus would cross into Oswald Street, but buses coming from Shawlands would cross the Jamaica Street Bridge, sometimes called Glasgow Bridge, heading over the Clyde and into the city centre. In the past you crossed Jamaica Street Bridge going in and coming out of the city centre, but today it is an exit-only road. The Jamaica Street and Oswald Street bridges have both seen a multitude of traffic over the decades, and the railway bridge above Oswald Street Bridge is where the trains enter and exit Central Station, to and from all points south. You won't see any of the old steam trains in Central Station nowadays, but it is still the hub for all traffic to the south side of Glasgow and Ayrshire, as well as the intercity trains to the main cities in England. Paisley's clothes shop stood on Jamaica Street for many years, and it was here that you bought the school uniforms for the many fee-paying schools in Glasgow. Sadly it too has departed, although the fee-paying schools are still going strong. I wonder where people buy the school uniforms now. On the 54 bus you travelled up Oswald Street and past Midland Street, which was once a main terminus for buses heading into the town from the south side. People on the south side will remember particularly the bus numbers 21, 23 and 39 going to Pollock that used Midland Street as a terminus, and the queues of people waiting for the buses who had to endure the smoke and fumes pouring out from the buses as they listened to the rumble of the trains on the bridge overhead rolling into Central Station. In the winter when it was wet and windy and full of people, buses and fumes, Midland Street was a chaotic hell. Fortunately the buses no longer stop here, and Midland Street is quiet now, with only the Arches Theatre and McSorley's Bar remaining. From Oswald Street you waited at the busy junction of Hope Street and Argyle Street, ready to head up Hope Street to the Kirkcardines. Close to the junction of Hope Street and Argyle Street on Argyle Street stood the Hielanman's Umbrella, so called because it used to be a meeting place for new arrivals coming into the city from the Highlands. The Umbrella is actually the Central Station Bridge, and you can clearly hear the trains coming in on a regular basis. But it is a good place to duck under if you are caught in the rain without an umbrella. Before it was mostly pedestrianised, Argyle Street was one of the busiest routes for trams and buses, as it ran from Trongate all the way out to the art galleries at Kelvin Grove in the West End. The biggest shops in Glasgow sat on Argyle Street, from Lewis's giant department store to Boots the chemist department store on the junction of Argyle Street and Union Street, where courting couples used to meet. People used to call Boots Corner the Dizzy Corner, as often one or other of the supposedly courting couple failed to turn up for a date. Other big shops on Argyle Street were Marks and Spencer's, Arnott Simpson's and Woolworths. Of all the big shops, only Marks and Spencer's is still the same today. Arnott's and Woolies are gone, and Lewis's is now Debenhams, with a lot of smaller shops on the ground floor which used to house the big food department of Lewis's. Argyle Street ran west under the Hielanman's umbrella and headed out past Anderston and Finniston on its way to the west end of the city. Anderston Cross was once a busy junction, and the Anderston railway station once teemed with passengers, but both have been buried under the concrete monster that is the motorway today. Anderston's old tenements have gone the same way, and while some people remained in the prison-like apartment blocks that replaced the tenements, the majority of people were scattered around the city. Anderston was once a flourishing industrial area of Glasgow in the early part of the 20th century, but today it is a ghost town. Back in the 54 bus from Crookston to Codder, going up Hope Street, you passed the impressive Victorian Central Hotel, which is still there today. Then past the many shops and offices that have changed hands on Hope Street but still remain. Hope Street is reputed to be the most polluted street in Glasgow today, although Renfield Street must be running it close, as cars, buses and taxis crowd these two main arteries in and out of Glasgow city centre. It wasn't much different in the past, with trams and buses jostling with each other for space. There were less cars then, but there didn't seem to be less traffic. The bus to Codder passed the Theatre Royal at the top of Hope Street, which was where the STV studios were. TV shows like the 1 O'Clock Gang with Larry Marshall used to be produced here in the 1960s, but now STV, like the BBC, have moved to Govan by the Clyde. Who would have predicted that in the 1950s and 60s? Beyond the Theatre Royal, the bus rolled past the Cacadens and headed for the road to Postle Park. Cacadens is another area in Glasgow that is unrecognisable from the past. All the tenements and most of the shops are gone now, and only a few buildings like the Piping Centre and the subway station remain from the 1950s and 60s. There is no doubt that Cacadens was a slum area, badly in need of regeneration, but the soulless concrete blocks that replaced the tenements are not what the people hoped for. Many of the inhabitants of Cacadens moved out to the new housing schemes in the Greenbelt, where they hoped for a better future. Many were disappointed. From Cacadens the bus headed for Postle Park and past the old Astoria Cinema in Maryhill, and then on through Postle Park where it turned at Saracen Cross, heading for Codder where the terminus stood. The bus passed the Vogue Cinema which stood for many years, until finally arriving at Codder where it stopped. There the driver and Clippy had time for a quick fag and a blether before heading all the way back again. An epic journey like that could and did take over an hour, especially at busy times of the day. Some of the areas of Glasgow where the trams and buses used to run have been completely changed, including Cacadens, Anderston, Gorbals and Townhead. The old Toon Heed, as it was known, lost all of its old tenements and its main road in and out of the city centre. Parliamentary Road in Townhead was as busy as Renfield Street is now with traffic, but the construction of the motorway saw it completely vanish. Castle Street remains, but only the Royal Infirmary stands there now, with all the old tenements and shops gone. Visitors to Townhead today, who had not seen it since the 1960s or 70s, would barely recognise it. Many of the old street names survive, like Glebe Street, Taylor Street, MacLeod Street, Parsons Street and Kennedy Street, but the houses, schools, pubs, shops and cinemas that they might have remembered are long gone. Another area that is barely recognisable from the past is Pollokshaws on the south side. The village of Pollokshaws has all but disappeared, its tenements demolished and most of its shops gone. The Cones textile factory, which employed many local people on Coustenholme Road for many years, is gone too, replaced by new private housing. No new industries have replaced the old, only food retailers. Even the giant tower blocks in Pollokshaws, which replaced the old tenements and cottages and dominated the landscape for miles around, are beginning to topple, although few people are sorry about that. Trams no longer cut through Pollokshaws, and only a single bus, the number 23, serves the local population nowadays. However, better housing is being built in the area, and there is a glimmer of hope of a revival. Of course, many areas in the city have barely changed at all, like Pollokshields, Langside and Battlefield, where the tenements and shops remain intact, despite being built well over a century ago. These tenements were not regarded as slums, even though they look exactly the same as those in areas like Townhead, Gorbals and Kinning Park, where many tenements were demolished. Gorbals, of course, was regarded as the ultimate slum in the past, despite the fact that it had many good tenements. Like Pollokshaws, the Gorbals tenements were demolished wholesale, to be replaced by tower blocks and deck-style housing that quickly became slums too. Bad design or bad construction or both saw them suffer dampness problems, and people hated living in them. They deservedly disappeared, but not quickly enough, and people had to suffer them for many years before they were demolished. Nowadays, many of the high-rise blocks are gone as well, and have been replaced by a mix of private and public housing of a far better standard, which looks set to remain for some time. Of course, it begs the question, why did they not build houses like that in the first place? When Glasgow Corporation decided, perhaps with the best of intentions, to demolish the slum tenements and replace them with tower blocks in Gorbals, Pollokshaws and Springburn in particular, they created the biggest housing disaster ever seen in the city, and sowed the seeds of the worst urban social deprivation that many still live with today. It was not the Glasgow councillors' finest hour. At least now in the 21st century they are trying to remedy that. Pity it has taken nearly 50 years to start. Today, with the trams gone, the buses continue to dominate the public transport of the city, and will carry you from Bridgeton and Parkhead in the east to Govan Hill and Bellahouston in the south, or Springburn in the north to Kelvinside in the west. Of course, many more people have cars today, so there are fewer buses than in the past. Although with the level of congestion in the city centre, many choose to leave their cars and commute to work in town by train and bus. The subway system too has been modernised, but has never been extended beyond the circle in and around the city centre that it always had, but it is still kept busy for all of that. And Central Station remains as busy as ever, with many more commuters travelling into the city to work, from the south side of Glasgow and all points south, right down to Ayrshire. When the last tram procession ran from the East End to Dalmuir West in 1962, it truly ended an era of travel much missed by the older generation. Had the trams remained in some form, there would have been far less pollution in the city centre and outlying areas, and who can count the cost of that pollution on the city dwellers' health over the decades? Other big cities like Manchester have successfully brought the trams back, and despite the financial problems and political incompetence in Edinburgh, they too will soon have the trams back in business. For the moment, Glasgow does not seem to want to, so the trams will continue to run only on film and in the memories of those who built them, lived with them, and who travelled and worked on them. Perhaps one day the old cars will make a comeback, and it will be a comeback fondly embraced by many.